Today's daf is daf Lamed Daled, and we'll start from the top of the Amud. Bishli Kasa Umei Sasa. The Gemara is now saying that if you have Truma Tmeya, which you're allowed to use as fuel, but of course you're not allowed to eat it, the Kohen is not allowed to eat Truma Tmeya, how do we allow him to use this Truma as fuel if it's edible? And we should have a chashash, we should be suspecting that maybe inadvertently, while he's using it as fuel and he's touching it and he's dealing with it, he may come to eat it. And the answer is we're only going to allow him to use this Truma Tmeya as fuel under the following conditions. Number one, it's shlikasa. He will take this, let's say he has kernels of wheat and he'll cook them, heavily cook them, mi'isasa, and then he'll place the chitim of Truma Tmeya together with eitzim, with firewood, and it'll become ma'us. Misusa means becomes repulsive. And therefore we're not afraid that he'll eat it. Now that was a statement of Rav Ashi in a different context, and we're going to see that context in just a minute. Hachinami, applying that here with regard to Rabbi Yochanan, we're going to allow in Rabbi Yochanan's framework to use the Truma Tmeya as fuel, but under the condition of shlikasa u'miyisasa, only if we know that he's not going to eat from it because it's already disgusting. It's mos. And the Gemara asks, "Ve'heche itmar de Rav Ashi?" What was the original context in which Rav Ashi made his statement? Aha. He made it with respect to a statement, the Omar Rabbi Ovin, Bar Rav Acham, Rabbi Yitzchak. Abba Shol had a very interesting role to play in the house of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He was what's called a gabal. He was in charge of legabel isos, to knead the doughs. And when Rebbe would purchase fuel, he would get a less expensive price by buying Truma Tmeya, which could be used as fuel. And the Kohen would sell it at a reduced slash price because it was not edible. And they would use the chitim shel Truma Tmeya as fuel to heat up a pot of water. And then they would use that water, lolush bahem isa bitahara, in order to knead the dough in a state of tara. Now, even though Rebbe was not a Kohen, and therefore he didn't have to be so careful about tara to make sure that nothing becomes tameh, but nevertheless, the very pious people in those days were makvid on chulin bitara. They were ochle chulin bitara. Now, if Rebbe fits that category of ochle chulin bitara, why wasn't he suspicious that maybe as they were dealing with this hot water that was heated up by Truma Tmeya, that somebody might contract tumah, meaning that there may be a contact between the Truma Tmeya and the water and the isa that is being kneaded? How could Rebbe allow that they would use the chitim shel Truma Tmeya, these wheat kernels, as a fuel substance? Nechush dilma osibahu lidei takola. Not only is there a problem of tumah, which we'll solve in just a minute, there's also an additional problem that somebody might come to eat it. And that's a takola. We don't eat Truma Tmeya. No one's allowed to eat Truma Tmeya. Even Kohanim are enjoined from Truma Tmeya. And in this context, Omar of Ashi b'shli pasa u'me'isasa, they would guarantee that these chitim, these kernels of wheat that they were using for fuel were softened up in a cooking process, and then they were thrown amongst these trees, these logs that we use as firewood, and they became moles. And therefore, we have no chashash that somebody might come to eat them. Now, as far as Tumah Vitara is concerned, Rashi adds a point there, which is about 8 lines down from the top of the Amud. Rashi says, "The batlilu mitaras ocha v'lo mitamu," which means that once they made these chitim so disgusting, the chitim forfeited the shame ochel, and therefore they would not retain their status of being mitame acherim. As far as tumas atzmo is concerned, it's not so clear, but they would not be mitame the Isa if there was any contact between these chitim and the Isa, because Rashi says, "Batlale mitoras ochel," that you null and void the status of ochel when it becomes so repulsive. Now, I'm not sure. For this, you really have to study. There's a Karnei Re'em and other achronim. The question is, how repulsive is this, these chitim, as a result of this whole process? Is it nifsal me'achilas adam, or is it even nifsal me'achilas kelev? Even a dog would find it repulsive. Rashi says, "Batlilu mitoras ochel." That would sound like it's even nifsal me'achilas kelev. But the Karni Re'em, one of the super commentaries here, he says that it is nifsal me'achilas adam. Okay, now the Gemara is going to deal with something called silim, which are the saplings that you put into the ground. And in this case, they took truma tmeya and they planted it in the ground. And this whole discussion, which is going to be quite a long discussion, is going to lead us back to Rabbi Yochanan at the end of Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. And Rabbi Yochanan, back on Daf Lamed Gimel, had made a statement in which he permitted what's called drichas anovim shenitma'u. He would allow pressing the olives and the grapes that had already contracted tumah, and he did it under certain specific conditions and rules. It had to be less than a kibetza. Abai bar Ovin, Rab Chanina, Chananya bar Ovin, Tanu Bei Rabba, Tanu Trumas Bei Rabba. So these were students that were studying in the Academy of Rabbah. They were studying Masechta Trumos. Pagabahu Rava Bar Masna. He's the hero of this story. He meets them and asks them the following question: Omerlahu, my amrisu. What chiddush or insight do you have Trumos de Beimar, from the study of Masechta Trumos in the Beis Medrash of Mar? Mar means a great man, in this case, Rabbah. Now, when Rava Bar Masna said that to these two young budding scholars, they intuited that he must have had a question, and something in the Mishnayos of Trumas was bothering him. Amrulei, so Abaye and Rav Chananya turned to Rava Bar Masna, and they say, "My Kashila, tell us what was bothering you about the laws of Trumos, and maybe while we're learning at the feet of Rabbah, we'll be able to come up with an answer to your question." Amalahu, so Rava Bar Masna says to them the following: this is what bothers me. Nine. We have a mission in the 9th parak of Trumos. Shesile trumos. So what we have here are these saplings, and they were mafresh truma from them. And we'll give an example of cabbage or leeks. Those are called kruvim and karshinin or krishin, shenitmu. And now these silim became truma tmeah. And then what did he do with it? The Mishnah describes a shesalon bekarka vishrisha. He took these saplings that were again truma tmeah, and he planted them in the ground. Tahorim milatame. As a result of the fact that they are now what's called mechubar lakarka, they're connected to the ground. Anything that's mechubar lakarka loses its shem ochel, and it's not tameh, which is really fascinating. It means that the tumah sort of dissipates into the air. However, the Mishnah nevertheless says, Asurim milechol, we still have an Isra Achila, even for Kohanim, it still retains its status as Truma Tmeah. So it's very strange. And this is exactly what bothers Rava Bar Masna. On the one hand, you're telling me that Tahora Milatame, that they cannot convey Tumah, they're Mechubar Lakarka, Batal Taurus Ochel, they're not Tmeim. And then you turn around in the same breath and you say, Asurim milechel, you're not allowed to eat them because it's Truma Tmeah. How can it be Truma Tmeah if it's not Tameh anymore? And that's his question. And the Kohanim are not allowed to eat this Truma, presumably because it has the status of Truma Tmeah. It's not Truma Tmeah, it's Tahorim milatame. It was bottled to the karka. Amrulei, Sabaye, and Rav Chananya, they respond to Rava Bar Masna's question, and they say, Hachi Omar Rabba, this is what Rabba had told us in the explanation of this Mishnah that you quote. My Asurim, what does the Mishnah mean when it says that it's also to eat it? Asurim lizarim, which means the following, that although Tumah is gone, and a Kohen would be allowed to eat these silim after they were planted in the ground, but a non-Kohen is enjoined from eating these, whatever cabbages or leeks will grow from the ground, because it still has truma. So there's no tumah, but it still has kedushas truma, and therefore Zar is not allowed to eat it. Rava Bar Masna is not happy. Why? According to these words, this interpretation of Rabbah, Maika Mashmalan, what is the chiddush of this Mishnah that tells me that the status of Truma is still retained even after you plant it? So you have Truma, now you planted Truma, that's called Gedule Truma. We have a principle that Gedule Truma, that any type of a vegetation that is Truma and you plant it, then it still retains the status of Truma. Even if you assume that what you plant, let's say you plant the seeds, they will disintegrate into the ground, and now something grows from these seeds, it still has the same Kedushas Truma that it had before you planted it in the ground. And that's Tanina, that's explicit in the Mishnah, in that very same chapter in Hilchos, in Masechta Trumos. Gedule Truma. Why would the Mishnah repeat, according to Rabbi's interpretation, what it had already established about Gedule Truma? Meaning that even if you plant it in the ground and it's Mechubal Karka, it still retains its status as Truma, hence it's also Lizorim. V'chi Tema, and perhaps you'll answer me the following, that the Mishnah is coming to teach me another chiddush. And what's that? Gidule gidulim. He took truma, planted it, and then after it grew, he took that which grew and put it back into the ground and replanted it. And the Mishnah wants to teach me a chiddush that it still retains its status as truma. Gidule truma is explicit in the Mishnah. But what's the status of gidule gidulim? For that, I need the other Mishnah of shesile trumos, that they still have the status of truma. Umay kamashmalon. And under what circumstances is the Mishnah teaching me this great chiddush that even gidule gidulim retain the status of truma? That's only bedavar she'ein zaro kola. It means that the seed itself that you plant in the ground is not disintegrated, but rather it grows, and it grows leaves, and a whole new vegetable is grown. And the Mefarshim say that this applies to bitzalim, for example, onions. You take a bulb of an onion, you plant it in the ground, and then the offshoots, the leaves will shoot out, but the bulb itself, the onion itself, still is intact. It doesn't disintegrate like other seeds usually disintegrate when you put them in the ground. Comes along Rava Bar Masna, and he says, that's not going to satisfy us, because even gidule gidulim, in a case of lo kala zera, is also explicit in a Mishnah, again in the same chapter of Trumas, and it says hatevel gidulav mutarim b'davar shezaro kola aval b'davar she'ein zaro kola afilu gidule gidulim asurim b'achila. So if you have the seeds that don't disintegrate and you replant them, for example, onions or maybe garlic, then when it grows a second round, that too has the status of tevel. The same isur tevel that applied to gidule tevel applies to gidule gidulim in a davar she'eino kola zara. So we see now that if tevel retains its status, and it remains usher not only after the first planting, but even after the second planting, and we're talking about ein zara kola, then once we know that, then certainly truma is that much more chomer than tevel. And if tevel retains its status and its iser in the state of gidule gidulim, how much more so truma? And once again, we don't know what the chiddush of the Mishnah was in the case of shesile truma ishtiku. And at this point, Abaye and Rabbi Hananya were quiet. They didn't have an answer. They were stumped. So now they turned to Rava Bar Masna, who stumped them. Maybe you heard something about this. And I gather, again, this is just my intuition, that in this whole encounter between Rava Bar Masna and Abaye and Hananya, what he was really doing was he's trying to challenge them. Oh, you think you're big shots. You know, you're learning Masechta Trumas at the feet of Rabba, the Yodam Gadol. Well, I got news for you. You don't know everything yet. Amalahu, here's the hero of the day. This is Rabba Bar Masna. Hachi Omar Rav Sheshes. This is what I heard from Rav Sheshes. What does the Mishnah mean when it says Shesile Truma Asurim, you're not allowed to eat them? It means Asurim leKohanim. Now, it lost its status of Tumah. It's no longer an Ochel because it was planted in the ground and it has a din of Mechubal Kak, and yet it has the status of Truma Tmeya, and the Kohanim are not allowed to eat it. How is that working? Says Rav Sheshes, there's another psul in truma other than tuma. And what is that? Hoil v'fsilu lahu behesech hadas. There is a halacha called hesech hadas, which means, and that applies both to truma and to kodshim, that if a person is no longer focused on the truma to guard it and protect it, the Torah says, mishmeres trumasi, you have to be shomer truma. Hesech hadas means he didn't lock it up. It wasn't under lock and key. He wasn't paying attention to it. He did not connect with it. And that's a psul in truma. And that psul in truma of hesech hadas will generate an isur on kohanim to eat the truma. Imagine, this is so hard for us to understand, to appreciate the sociology of it, that they were so careful about truma that if there was hesech hadas and they interrupted their concentration on the truma and they left it exposed, then it became possible. And therefore, we go back to the Mishnah of Shsilei Trumo Shenitmu Ushasolon. They were placed into the karka. Now they're mechuber l'karka, they're tahorim mituma, but yet the kohanim are enjoined from eating it because of a different psul, that once they put in the ground, they were meisiach das, and by interrupting and discontinuing their mental protection and supervision over the truma becomes excluded, and it's possible, such that even the kohen cannot eat it. Now, at this point, the Gemara is going to introduce a machlokes, a fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about the status of the psul of hesech hadas. Is it a psul unto itself, or is it only a psul because we anticipate or we're afraid that it contracted tumah? You weren't careful about it, you didn't guard it properly, and therefore it contracted tumah. This makes a lot of sense according to Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish is going to hold that hesech hadas psul haguf havi. It means it's a psul unto itself. Forget about whether it contracted tumah. Even if Eliyahu Navi would come and say it did not contract tumah, it would still be possible because of hesech hadas. Hesech hadas is a category unto itself. Gigantic machlokas in the Rishonim, whether that's the Oraisa or that's the Rabbanan. Is Shapir, now we understand that Shesile Truma, insofar as he was Meisiach Das from the Truma, they therefore are Asurim Bachila for the Kohanim, even though they are Tahorim, and you can guarantee that they're Tahorim. And again, how do I guarantee that Tahorim? Just to repeat what we said before, once they become a Chubel Karka, Batlu Luhu Toras Ocha, and therefore it cannot be Tomid. But what are we going to do according to Rabbi Yochanan? He holds that hesech hadas pasul psul tumahavi. If you want to categorize the essence of this category called hesech hadas, it belongs to the category of tameh. It's tameh. He wasn't shomer the truma, and therefore we suspect that maybe he contracted tumah. Is Michael a Meimar? How are you going to explain the Mishnah based on Rav Sheshes? After all, Rav Sheshes understands very well that these Shesile Truma are not Tmeim, and therefore, how could Rav Sheshes postulate that the reason why the Mishnah says that Asurim L'Kardim and the Apostle for Truma is because of Hesek Hadas? If Hesek Hadas, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is only because of Tumah, here there's no Tumah. The Mishnah says it explicitly. Tahorim L'Tameh. And the reason for that is because it's Mechuber L'Karka. And the Gemara says, the Itmar, we're going to present a machlokes regarding Hesek Hadas. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psul Tumah Havi. We're afraid that it contracted Tumah. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Amar Psul Aguf Havi. Let's assume for a moment that this is a drabanan. I'm just making that assumption according to those shitos. So then, what the Rabbanan did is they set up a new psul called Hesek Hadas. Even if you know for sure it wasn't Makabel Tumah, it's possible he did Hesek Hadas. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Psul Tumavi Im Yavo Elio V'Yitarenu. If Elio would come and say that this truma did not contract tuma, then show him lo. Why? Because the whole nature of the psul of Pesach Hadas, because of the chash, we're afraid that maybe it came in contact with tuma, but now we have Elio and Navi to rely on. But Shimon Lakish Omer, thank you Elio, but no thanks. Psul Aguf Havi Shim Yavo Elio V'Yitarenu ain't showing lo. We're not going to listen to Elio and Navi. This is not called Kofar B'divrei Navi. Here the Navi is describing a Mitzias, but that Mitzias, although we accepted, and I totally trust Elio and Navi that there was no contact with Tumah, but it doesn't matter. There's a separate Psul Aguf, according to Reish Lakish, called Hesek Hadas. Now the Gemara is going to present a series of questions that Rabbi Yochanan fired at Reish Lakish. The latter had presented the view of Psul Aguf. Eisvei, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon, we have a brisa, Rabbi Shmuel ben Osho, Rabbi Yochanan ben Brok Omer, Lul Katan. You have a small, I will call it a crevice or an open area. Haya ben Kevesh Limizbeach. And what happens is that any kodshim that became possible were placed, I shouldn't say any kodshim, because now we're talking about ophos, we're talking about birds. And the birds were on the southwestern side of the Mizbeach, and that's where they had an open area between the ramp and the Mizbeach itself. And if there was a psul, let's say during the Avodas HaKarban, let's say the Kohen had the wrong machshava, and it became puzzle, so that's where they would throw it into that crevice, and they would leave it overnight. We'll try to explain as we go along why they did this whole procedure. So Lul Katan, there was this open area that was built into the floor of the Azara, and it was Ben Kevesh LeMizbeach. It was on that corner, which was close to the place where the Kevesh met the Mizbeach, and it was B'ma'aravo Shel Kevesh. It was on the western side of the Kevesh, and Shama Yuzarkim Sulei Chatos Ha'of. If a Chatos Ha'of became possible, and we're talking about a carbon chova, which is an obligatory carbon that comes to be mechaper on certain chatoim, and it also applies in the case of a mechusa kapara in Dalus. If they were too poor to afford an animal, they brought an oaf instead. An oaf was considered much less expensive. Anyway, there's something called a chatos ha'of. And what happened after they took this psule chatos ha'of, it became possible. Instead of burning it immediately, which is what we do with with kodshim shenifsalu, they threw it there and to ubar tsarasan, and they left it overnight. Now we have to ask two questions. Number one, why didn't they burn it? And number two, why did they leave it overnight in this guma, in this lul? So to answer the first question, as to why they didn't burn it, Rashi says that it wasn't really completely possible. There was a psul. We'll see later on exactly what this halfway measure psul is, but it still had some vestige of the status of kodshim, and it would be prohibited to burn it immediately. We have to wait until to ubar tsurasan. Now, what happens with to ubar tsurasan? What's that all about? So that's what's called a psul of lina. Lina means that if you leave the kodesh, the kodshim, beyond its allotted time for eating, or just the very fact that you left it overnight and tomorrow is already a different day and you won't be able to eat it tomorrow, it becomes possible. That's called the psul of lina. So that even though when the chatas of became psula, we were not allowed to burn it, but by leaving it overnight and it becomes possibly din lina, that's a complete psul. As I said before, we didn't burn it because it was half puzzle and half kosher, but now it's completely puzzle. That's called te'ubar tzuras. And now at this point we can burn it, which is what we do with kodshim shenifsalu. Yotzin lebeis hasreifa. They had a special area in the Azara where they burned kodshim tmeim or kodshim psulim. And the Gemara says the following. What happens during this time period overnight when they throw the chata asaof shenifsala into this lul? Iyamrit bishlema sul tumahavi. If we're going to assume that the psul of hesek hadas, meaning that this case of chata asaof became possibly mitam as a result of hesek hadas, which means that we're afraid lest it became tameh, which is Rabbi Yochanan Shita that hesek hadas is a psul tuma. Is then mishum hachi boy ibur tzura. I now understand why we had to guarantee that there was a psul. We weren't allowed to burn it in its time, because hesek hadas is a chash tuma. We're worried and concerned that maybe it contracted tuma. We don't know that for sure. Maybe Eliyahu is going to come, and he's going to tell us that this is tar. So how can we go ahead and burn it? The answer is by leaving it overnight inside this lul, inside this guma. It becomes possibly din lina, and now we know that we can burn it. But Ella according to Yureish Lakish, that the psul of hesek hadas is a psul aguf, and Eliyahu Hanavi wouldn't make a dent over here. We're not talking about, well, did it contract tumah, did it not? It's possibly din psul aguf, and if that applies to truma, how much more so there's a psul of hesek hadas in kodshim. So why not burn it immediately? Normally, ibur tzura, why do you have to wait till the psul of lina will be chal tomorrow morning? Let's burn it today. Vitnan, and we have a Mishnah, or Tanya, it's a Brisa, Zaklal, and here we turn to Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Just give me 1 minute here for technicalities here.